Okay, we are recording. I'm Brandon Polite, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Knox College, and I am joined by Nick Riggle, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of San Diego in San Diego, California. Thanks so much for joining me, Nick.
My pleasure. I'm excited to talk to you. This is a lot of good topics. My favorite.
Awesome. So we are going to talk about two of your papers, Convergence, Community, and Force and Aesthetic Discourse, which is forthcoming from Ergo, and Toward a Communitarian Theory of Aesthetic Value, which is forthcoming in the Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism. And so I guess taking the Ergo piece first, in that paper, you're talking about aesthetic discourse and what the nature of aesthetic discourse is. And you're offering an alternative to what is the main view in aesthetics, which is that the whole point of aesthetic discourse is, you know, if you and I are talking about a work of art, or if we're disagreeing about a work of art, right, its value or its interpretation or its meaning, right, that what we're trying to do is get to, you know, a single unified judgment, right, that this is the way it really is. Perhaps it's, you know, a realist view that, you know, we act as if there's some objective value that our discourse is tracking and that we're ultimately trying to converge upon. You argue that that's not the right.
Yeah, or we're trying to share feelings. You know, you can be expressivist about it.
Yeah.
Like the idea is either, yeah, we're trying to share a representation of the mind-independent aesthetic world, or there's some value in sort of like converging on feelings. So we're trying to have the same sort of affective stance or attitude towards the thing.
Yeah, right. And so you disagree with that view. And so what's wrong with the convergence view of aesthetic discourse?
So there's a sense in which it's not wrong, and a sense in which it is wrong. So in my view, so the sense in which it's not wrong is that it's a perfectly legitimate thing to try to do this in aesthetic conversation. So whether we're talking about the beauty of a sunset, or sort of natural beauty, or of someone's style, or of, you know, a fine painting in a museum or something, what we could do in our conversation in part is try to figure out what we both think about it and try to sort of share our affective life together, have the same feelings toward it or the same beliefs. But the convergence view says that that's the point of aesthetic conversation, such that any conversations that don't try to do that are defective, or in some other way sort of criticizable. So the problem, I think, with that is that there's a lot of aesthetic conversations that we have where we're just not trying to converge. And instead, what we seem to be doing is sharing our different aesthetic takes on some aesthetic item and learning more about each other's sensibilities. Now, that might have the effect of, you know, your views change a little bit and my views change a little bit. But even if we don't converge, I think there can be really successful aesthetic conversations where instead of converging, we somehow, I like to talk about vibing, or in other words, there's a mutual appreciation of style, individuality, sensibility, where I come to see the aesthetic valuer that you are, you come to see the aesthetic valuer that I am. And there's something, you know, kind of mutually enlivening about that. And I think that we can enter that state even if we don't converge in our aesthetic beliefs or our aesthetic feelings. Converging in our aesthetic beliefs and feelings is often a good way to enter that state, but it's not the only way. And that's why I disagree with the convergence view, which, as far as I can tell, is basically everyone's view. So as of now, I'm very much an outsider and an outlier in this, but I think there's really something to the view that I develop in Convergence, Community, and Force in aesthetic discourse.
Yeah, right. And so Yeah, if you and I are disagreeing about something, right? How we go about disagreeing is I'm trying to convince you that I'm right, you're trying to convince me that you're right. And it seems that in order to do that, right, we have to have this shared goal of getting it right, right? There is a right way to do this, but you've got it wrong, I've got it right. And so let me tell you the reasons why you're wrong and I'm right. Um,
Right.
and it seems like you could do that in a way that's vibing, right? In your sense that,
Yeah.
that this disagreement can go in a really fruitful way where I'm sort of, not so much becoming persuaded by you, but I'm learning more about how you're appreciating the object and how you're coming at, the song or the movie or whatever, right? And so I'm getting an
Mhm.
appreciation of your worldview, which, could impact my worldview, right? How I approach aesthetic
Yeah.
objects, but it need not do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. So I think we can vibe in this style of conversation where like I think you're wrong and you think I'm wrong, and but it's really going to depend on your style, whether that is successful in creating the kind of community that I think governs aesthetic conversation. So, but in other words, you have to be the right kind of person to kind of let your style shine. Where we do have this shared goal of like convincing the other that they're wrong, and I'm right. Not everyone's sort of like keyed up for that style of conversation, and some people might even find it, I don't know, kind of. Too masculine or too aggressive or too, and I think there's ways of having aesthetic conversation that's much more open and inviting. Yeah.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's sort of the heart of your view, right? Is that aesthetic discourse is essentially invitational, right? Where I'm inviting
Yeah.
you to see something or to appreciate something.
Yeah. Well, it, I'm not sure I'd say essentially invitational, because I think that we can have good forms of aesthetic discourse that don't have that illocutionary force, but that nonetheless satisfy the norms of community. Um, but it's centrally and typically invitational. Like invitation has, as I put it in the paper, pride of place in aesthetic discourse. And the reason is that so the sort of discourse governing norm is what I call community and not convergence. So that norm says basically try to vibe with the other person, right? See what you can do to get into this state of mutual appreciation of individuality. And because that's the aim of aesthetic discourse, invitation functions extremely well in getting the vibing started. So the thought is, when I say, man, Brandon, that's a beautiful sunset, what I'm doing in part is inviting you to uh, look at the sunset and exercise your sensibility on it. I'm saying, hey, tell me what you think, right? Basically, tell me what you aesthetically think, or how do you aesthetically value that, if at all. You could take up the invitation, you could decline the invitation, you could be rude. There's all kinds of things you could do in response. But if I issued a good invitation that was appropriately sensitive to your sensibility and style, then and you take it up and you say, "Oh yeah, it's a wonderful sunset," or "I think it's a boring sunset." There's a way of saying it that's kind of like it's expressive of your sensibility, but not declining of the invitation. Anyway, if it's a good invitation, you take it up right away. You're expressing your sensibility, I'm expressing my sensibility, and we're off and running, right? Community is already being, or very, at least starting to be satisfied. We're on the road to vibing. So that's why invitation is so important in aesthetic discourse as I see it. Compare invitation to something stronger. A Kantian might think the illocutionary force of an aesthetic claim is an invitation. It's a demand, right? Something more forceful. When I say that's beautiful, I'm not saying, hey, I invite you to aesthetically value that thing. Rather, I demand that you do so, or maybe something even stronger. I demand that you agree with me. In that case, I think I see that as kind of skewing the aims of aesthetic discourse toward agreement, when we don't necessarily have to agree to sort of reap the benefits of aesthetic conversation.
Yeah, right. The Kantian way of, I speak for, my judgment speaks for everyone, right? So it's not just you have to agree, it's every rational agent has to agree with this assessment. And I think it's really hard to see how a Kantian, would be like convinced by someone else that their view is mistaken or misguided, right? I feel that view really leads to solipsism really quickly.
Yeah, I mean, they could be shown to be making some kind of mistake. I think that's available to the Kantian. The idea is that you want to speak with this universal voice. You want to tap into this sort of the sensus communis, right? And with the aim of realizing this universal community of shared feeling, which is I think it's a really attractive, in some ways, really attractive aim. I think it, as I claim in the paper, it has, I think, really fatal flaws. But I also think that in this era of sort of rethinking aesthetic value, rethinking aesthetic community, rethinking the norms of aesthetic discourse and all this stuff, I think it's sort of on the table for someone to really defend Kantianism along these lines. But yeah, I have a fondness for the aims there, but I can't go along with it. I don't think it's right. So yeah.
Okay, so cool. So let's get a bit more into vibing, right? Which is
Sure.
this sort of mutual appreciation of each other's individuality, right? So when you invite me to look at the sunset by saying, hey man, this sunset's beautiful, right? And you've invited me and I take you up on the offer, right? I accept the invitation, I look at it, I think about it, and we start talking about it, right? So how does that develop into, that's sort of the initial stages of vibing. How does that become a full-blown instance of vibing in your view?
Yeah, so vibing is one way to talk about, one word to describe the communal state that I think is the sort of the point of aesthetic valuing. Now, that communal state, I think, is exhibited in a lot of different aesthetic practices and aesthetic events. So at a great concert, at a good dinner party, at a great festival or like dance club or something. When you're in a band and you're really working well together, when maybe you're or like at a good improv show or improvisational jazz band. Pretty much, I actually think, well, I'm kind of committed to the thought that basically every good aesthetic practice has vibing in it, and it's kind of the point of the practice. So in the conversation about the sunset, we would be vibing insofar as, when I said it's a beautiful sunset and I thereby invited you to exercise your sensibility on the thing I was looking at, and you do, and you say, oh yeah, it is beautiful. Now, if you just said it's beautiful in a kind of polite way and that was the end of it, we wouldn't be vibing. It wouldn't be clear that you were really exercising your sensibility to me. It would be just kind of like, but if you said it in a very sincere way and you pointed out like, oh yeah, like that hue of pink is just, it reminds me of whatever, or it's my favorite color, or there's a lot of things you could say that would make it clear in conversation that You really are exercising your sensibility. Um, and of course, if you do say those things and you make aesthetic claims in response, then as per the invitational view, you thereby invite me to exercise my sensibility on the same object as described in these further ways, right? As having a dusty pink that blends with the tangerine orange, that, whatever you say, it's like, oh yeah, but then, so the vibing is in the kind of that interaction that's focused on aesthetic value and gets us to sort of continue and deepen our aesthetic valuing practices on this object. Now we talked about a sunset. That's an easy one to pick, an easy example to pick because it's so accessible. But if we're strangers on a bus or something, like it's kind of one of the only things we can really go on, unless, I don't know, maybe you have like a really cool punk outfit on and I'm like, yo, those spikes are great, because I also have, maybe some punkist sensibility or something. But I think often these conversations happen with people that we know more than we typically know a stranger, a friend or an acquaintance or a colleague or something like that. And that allows us to invite those people into aesthetic conversations that focus on the things that we know that they maybe like or would like to value. So, maybe it's vintage Mustangs or motorcycles or, cool socks or, fancy eyeglasses. It could be anything. It doesn't have to be like a work of art with a capital A.
Yeah, right. And one thing that just occurred to me is that, these communities, right? So, and it's you and I on a bus and you look out the window and see the sunset and you turn to me, a stranger, and say, wow, that's beautiful, right? That's sort of a moment where the community is sort of being created right there, or at least there's a potential for that. If I just, ignore you, right? Or if I just sort of give a perfunctory, like, yeah, it's all right, right? Then the potential for that community has, not actualized. But if I take you up, then okay, we have this mini community that's formed. But when you're talking about friends or acquaintances, people those communities already exist, right? We have histories with these people, and we've had conversations with them, and we've had agreements and disagreements, and we sort of have a sense of how they operate, how they appreciate things, right? And when you go to a concert together, you listen to an album or watch a movie or go to a play or share a meal or play a game or whatever with one another, right? You sort of have that background that you're operating with, and that allows the vibing to happen perhaps easier in some cases, right? Because I know how to vibe with this person. I've done it in the past. And so what we're doing is, we're deepening that sense of connection and this, shared project that we have of appreciating things together. And I think you're right that it's not, convergence that we're after. It's this just more communal thing of being with one another and of deepening our relationships with one another. And I think, a commonality between these two papers of yours that we're talking about is that valuing art is a way of valuing each other, right? Either, interpersonally or, it's a way of valuing humanity, perhaps, if we want to go, full blown.
Full Schiller.
Full Schiller. Full Schiller, right? That we're valuing the whole human community. Right. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on that issue?
Yeah, I mean, you got it exactly right. I think that, my view is that there's a higher form of community that we can form as human beings who have individualities, who have this ability to what I call, exercise our discretionary valuing capacities. So this ability to sort of freely value, to be like, I can kind of like whatever I want or spend time with these objects of value in whatever way that I decide. I can decide to get into Norwegian black metal. I can decide to get into, cocktail dresses. I can decide to get into, long haircuts or wild beards. these choices that I can make, and I can even decide to create these objects if I have the time. And yeah, you nailed it. You know, the sort of point of doing that is to, as it were, entice and invite each other into these relationships where we're kind of egging each other on. You know, like I say a thing that, or I say or create a thing that gets you to say or create a thing, and then we see what each other is doing, and you know that moves us to say or create another thing that, you know, and you know, next thing you know, like we're vibing, we're creating artworks, we're responding to aesthetic value with claims and creations in a way that spurs other people to do the same thing. And that, you know, that's aesthetic life. That is what it's all about, in my view. And when there are cultural resources for human beings to engage in these practices, the valuing practice in general, and then the particular aesthetic practices in particular, like making music and painting or whatever your culture has the resources to engage you in, then I think humanity is just in a way better state than if you don't have those opportunities and resources. And that, you know, as a collective, we should try to let vibing flourish, you know, to put a sort of California twist on it.
That's great. And so, I mean, this hooks into, you know, your idea, you know, one of your central ideas from your book, which I have right here, on being awesome, which is a really terrific book from a few years ago, is, you know, social openings, right? That the point of, you know, being awesome is ultimately about creating social openings whereby others can express their individuality, right? And I mean, I feel that what you're doing and, you know, your recent work very much is following from that, and vibes, to be, you know, use a dad pun, very much vibes with, you know, what you said in the book, right? That, you know, these aesthetic conversations, you know, these aesthetic objects, right, created by artists or, you know, nature, you know, have this capacity to open up things socially for us, right? And when other people draw our attention to these objects or aspects of these objects, they're inviting us and creating this opening for us to express ourselves, right? And maybe find, you know, not just new ways of expressing ourselves, but new ways of conceiving ourselves, right? And through our relationships with other people.
Yeah, new ways of creating your individuality, right? You know, you can't be a Bowie person unless there's David Bowie around.
Exactly, and he's all over my mug right now. So.
Oh my gosh, I love that mug.
Yeah.
Oh
it's
wow,
like all
that's
of the
so
Bowies,
cool.
you know, throughout the
Oh, I
years.
kind of need that.
Yeah,
that's so good.
It's awesome.
Very much so. Yeah. So no, that's a really, I'm glad you see that connection. I was sort of wondering how whether people would see the connection or not, but you're right. So like on being awesome, you can think of it as a way of taking my theory of aesthetic value and aesthetic discourse and saying, hey, how does this look in like public life? Like, how do we create this thing in public life? And then of course the sort of trick is to say that that's what awesomeness is all about, right? This sort of popular word. But in a way, it's a kind of a bait and switch. It's a kind of like, hey, this is about awesomeness. Don't you love awesomeness? Like, no, this is how you aestheticize public life, right? This is how you create and attend to aesthetic value when you're just ordering coffee or like walking down the street or sitting out, you know, sitting at a basketball game during halftime or sitting at the bus stop or, you know, or whatever, along the many different things that I discuss in the book. So yeah, so awesomeness in the book, I talk about awesomeness, which is the value that is realized when someone is awesome, that is good at creating a social opening, and another person is down. They're willing to take it up. So awesomeness is vibing. It's the same value. But in the book is very much about kind of public and civic life, and less less about sort of aesthetic life in general, which includes, lots of other things. But yeah, if you're reading this book and thinking about aesthetic value, and you just replace every instance of awesomeness with aesthetic value, I think you'll kind of, oh, that's what Riggle's up to, right? Yeah, I don't know if I've actually said that in a public interview like this before, but it's true. And yeah, but as a result, I think there's a cool way, and this is something I want to develop more. I've actually worked on this a fair amount. I've given a couple talks about it, but the taxonomy I give in the book is really a kind of it's a kind of ethico-aesthetic, I call it that in the book, but it's a kind of ethico-aesthetic taxonomy of the norms of aesthetic life. And it's not just, about awesomeness. It's any aesthetic conversation, even like when you're playing in a band, or or dancing at a concert, or all kinds of things. I mean, I think that these norms apply. So it's the kind of, I call it the ethics of awesomeness in the book, but more generally, it's the sort of ethico-aesthetic norms of aesthetic engagement. So I have a paper where I kind of make that broader case that, like, if aesthetic life is all about realizing these states of vibing, then there are ways of going right, there are ways of going wrong, and we have to be able to say what those norms are, what gives them authority, and so on, just kind of like almost just like a standard ethics. A lot of the same ethical sort of like problems and questions arise in that scenario, because it is a structure of practice, right? But it's not purely ethical because it's aesthetic, and there's something else that's good. Vibing is not the same as respecting a human being. There's something else going on there, and I think philosophers haven't been great at recognizing that distinctive value, for whatever reason. I mean, neglect of aesthetics, overly moralizing everything, thinking of aesthetics even when you're not neglecting it in terms of morality, or in terms of if you're like a sort of certain type of realist, as just sort of very much like our engagement with empirical reality, just kind of representing the truth, and there's experts who can do it, and we argue and we disagree, we try to converge. So anyway, yeah, I'm kind of talking for a long time, but I think the connections with the book are yeah, they're there, and yeah, I'm glad you realized that.
Yeah, good. I'm glad I got the confession on video. Like this is really just a trick to get you to a clever ruse to get you to admit that.
Well, there's something kind of weird about, like, I published this book 5 years ago, almost 5 years, no, 4 years ago, almost 4 years ago, and I'm just now publishing like the sort of main core views that, like, the theory of aesthetic discourse, the theory of aesthetic value, that actually like kind of structure. It's like I should have written this book like in 15 years, like, as the public facing kind of like version of the sort of my view, but no, I mean, I don't have it all worked out, but I have a lot of it worked out. So
yeah, cool. So one question I have is that your account of aesthetic value is communitarian, right? It's very much community oriented, that our aesthetic lives are going well when they are other directed, right? When we're vibing with others. But how then do you account for, oftentimes we do have, very profound private experiences with works of art, with music, with nature, with literature, right? Reading a novel, listening to an album on our headphones, right? Even in a public space like an art museum, right? Like, I've had very profound personal experiences in front of paintings where sort of everyone else around me sort of just recedes into the background of my experience, right? It's as if they're
Yeah.
not there. And so how do you
Yeah.
account for these sort of deeply personal, private experiences of art on your communitarian account of aesthetic value?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And, it reminds me of one of my favorite papers in aesthetics, which is by Richard Moran, called Kant, Proust, and the Appeal of Beauty. I think I cite it in like 50% of my papers or something. I cite it all the time. I love that paper. Uh, and in that paper, he talks about this famous encounter in Search of Lost Time, the great novel by Marcel Proust, and where Marcel, encounters these hawthorn flowers in bloom and has this just like really deep personal experience of their beauty, and in having that experience of their beauty, kind of attaches himself to the beauty in this really deep way. Like the thought is like, I'm partly constituted as a self by the beauty of these flowers. They're so beautiful to me, and their being beautiful to me is part of who I am. And that is something that I take really seriously in my communitarian view. So the idea is that the notion of community that I think is like the point of aesthetic life is one where we commune as individuals. And so that individuality has to be like articulated to yourself, maybe not super explicitly, but at least in the terms of like, I can point to my David Bowie mug and be like, it's all about David Bowie. Or, I can point to the hawthorn flowers and be like, maybe I'm weird, but like, holy moly, those are beautiful. And so those experiences, they can seem very personal and even maybe isolating, but those are some of the experiences wherein we are cultivating our individuality. We are making sense of ourselves as appreciators, as aesthetic valuers. And that's a super important part of aesthetic life. You can't commune with anyone over your aesthetic valuing practices unless you've had those kind of formative experiences. I call them aesthetic attachments in a paper called "On the Aesthetic Ideal," where I argue that conceptions of aesthetic life fail to take into account the importance of these experiences. So yeah, I think they're super important, and their importance is very much part of my communitarian view. Even though I do emphasize community, it's community among individuals who have had these experiences, who have their aesthetic attachments.
Yeah, and there are things that we can share with one another, right? I mean, even if no one's listening to the album with me right there, or no one's looking at the painting with me, it's something we can talk about after the fact, right?
Yeah, totally. And
unless you're dealing with like a piece of improv that's like not right there, boom, done, over, right? And then
yeah,
like, oh shit, there's no one else around. There's no one there to share it
right.
with. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, with Marcel, you don't even necessarily have to share his sensibility. You might just think, oh, Marcel, like, he just loves those hawthorn flowers. It's wonderful. I don't really like, I think they're beautiful, but like, wow, Marcel is just like on another level. Or, I think they're boring, but like, there's something about, Marcel's sensibility that I see as sort of aesthetically engaging, given my aesthetic valuing practices. I might be intrigued by Marcel's individuality. I might want to know more. Like his love of the hawthorns might make me think, what is it about Marcel? What else is he into? Like, how do the hawthorns figure in to the rest of his life? There might be something curious there to me. I might just be intrigued by his style in some way, and want to vibe. That impulse to be like, I want to know more, or like I want to be inspired, or and if it's mutual, then we're living our aesthetic lives, and it's all good.
Yeah, right. And even if I myself don't come to love the hawthorns or appreciate the hawthorns in the way that he does, right, there's something of value to be had by just hearing someone who's really into something geek out about it, right? And like gush and
Yeah,
share their love. Like that's like wonderful, right?
totally. Exactly. Yeah. And it's an engine of aesthetic life, of our aesthetic valuing practices. It might be something that, in hearing it makes us like inspired to do something aesthetic, create something, try a new outfit, like go to the countryside. And maybe I'm not looking at hawthorns, but I'm looking at the beautiful creeks that I love. So yeah, and this goes back to my disagreement with convergence theorists. I might even think that you're making a mistake, right? I might think, Marcel's really overvaluing those flowers. They're cool, but like, my God. Um, but it might be that mistake that makes me so intrigued by his style. It's the fact that he's overvaluing that I'm like, wow, that's intense in a good way, or something like that. The mistake, it's like kind of neither here nor there, in a sense.
Yeah, awesome. So one last question, right? And thinking about private experiences, right? We can imagine people who, they have this personal relationship with the work of art or with the work of a given artist, right?
Mhm.
Say, you can imagine someone who loves David Bowie, like myself, and who really likes listening to David Bowie, but who, for whatever reason, right? And we could assume it's not like social anxiety or anything of that sort, but just
Mhm.
has no interest in sharing those experiences with anyone else, right? Of listening to Bowie with other people, or of talking about David Bowie's work, or
Yeah.
trying rank top 10 album lists with one another and argue
Mhm.
about that, right? All the stuff that we normally do when we love an
Yeah.
artist. This person doesn't want to do that. They want to keep this deeply private into themselves, right?
Yeah.
Would you advise that such a person try to be more socially open? Is it that there's something going wrong in their aesthetic life if they want to keep this part of themselves private and not out there in the world?
Good question. Yeah. So there's a couple of things I would say about that case. So one of them is that there's a sense in which they're missing out. So I would say that they're kind of missing out, but I want to qualify it. So they're missing out on some of the communal goods, which is not missing out on a small thing, because in my view, that's like the thing, right? Um, and one way to sort of highlight that is to say, look, I mean, if they love David Bowie that much, I mean, go to a David Bowie concert and see what happens, right? That feeling of like, I mean, you can't, sadly, because he passed away, but imagine, the vibing that would happen given your love of David Bowie if you went to a great David Bowie concert. Something, I predict something magical would happen. And that magical thing is like what aesthetic life is, that's the value, that's the good. But the other thing I want to say, so they're missing out on sort of maybe the more intense registers of the value, but they're not missing out on the value entirely, because they're vibing with David Bowie in their, as it were, in their relationship with the artist through their recordings, or their videos, or whatever it is, in their private sort of valuing practice. They are, vibing can happen there, right? It's sort of strange in some ways. I mean, it's familiar to us, but it's not face to face because of like the recording technology, and it's sort of one-sided, because David Bowie doesn't know maybe about you being in the room all alone, like loving David Bowie, but I'm sort of, something really deep and communal, and vibey can happen even when it's just you and Bowie, right? I just watched the Billie Eilish documentary on Apple TV, or what is it called? Apple Plus or something. I can't remember.
Yeah.
But
They all have pluses. So yeah.
yeah, something. There's a Billie Eilish doc. And, you know, famously, she loves Justin Bieber. And Bieber's like super formative for her. And when she's asked about, you know, Justin Bieber, she's like, well, like I'm not a fan. Like you can't say you can't describe me as a fan. Like I am him. Like he is me. Like, and it's just this super, she just like loves, like literally loves Justin Bieber. And when they actually finally meet in person, she just like can't even look at him. Like it's like looking at the sun. She literally can't look at him for like 15 minutes or something. And then finally she does, and he graciously just like stands there and waits for her. Finally, she looks at him and they embrace. And then she just spends like 5 or 10 minutes crying in his arms, like literally just like bawling. And he's just like stroking her hair, and like it's really sweet. But I think that shows you this, you know, how far this can go, even in kind of your private, as it were, private like valuing life, where you're not valuing with others. There's still this kind of like connection that can be formed, and this value can be realized. Again, I just don't think like it's quite as you know, the sort of register of it is not as intense and good in some ways as it can be if you're doing it with other people.
Cool. Well, thank you, Nick. I think we'll end it there. I really appreciate it. This was really
my pleasure.
fun.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, it was fun too. Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah.